Since ancient times, the ocean has seemed to people like something unexplored and almost infinite. Sailors spoke of dark depths where light disappears and where unknown life forms might lurk. Centuries have passed. Instruments, technologies, and deep-sea vehicles have emerged. Humans have been able to descend to places where even sunlight once could not reach. And it is precisely there that the strangest discoveries began. Creatures that glow in complete darkness, structures on the sea floor whose shapes seem too perfect, and even signals whose origin still raises questions. Despite all of science's achievements, most of the ocean remains unexplored, and perhaps the most important answers still lie deeper than we can imagine. In this video, we'll try to delve into these mysteries, calmly, step by step, exploring what is known and what remains a mystery for now. Many centuries ago, the world seemed much quieter to people and much more mysterious. There were no maps showing the ocean floor. There were no instruments capable of measuring depth. There were no words that could accurately describe what lay hidden beneath the water's surface. There was only one thing: the surface, and an endless, almost physically palpable sense of the unknown beneath it. This feeling is hard to put into words. It wasn't fear, or not just fear. Rather, it was an awareness, a quiet, constant awareness that the world is bigger than the part we can see, that beyond the edge of what we can see and touch, something else begins. Something vast, dark, and silent. The ocean was always nearby. Ancient people lived side by side with the sea. They woke up to a view of the water. They fell asleep to its sound. They knew every curve of the shore, every rock by the water, every spot where the waves broke differently. The sea was part of their lives. Not a backdrop, but a neighbor. A presence that could not be ignored. In the morning, when the water was calm and almost transparent, you could look into it as if into a mirror and see your own face, the sky, the birds. It seemed as though the ocean was open and understandable. It seemed as though it were simply water. By day, everything changed. The sun reflected off the waves, and the sea became bright, almost blinding. It moved, shimmered, never stood still. It was alive. That was obvious. You couldn't help but feel it. In the evening, it grew dark. Gradually, just as the sky grows dark. Not all at once, but slowly losing its color. First blue, then gray, then almost black. And in that blackness, something changed. Not on the outside, but inside the person who was watching. The evening ocean was different. It no longer reflected the sky. It absorbed it. But no matter how long they looked, in the morning, at noon, in the evening, in any weather, at any time of year, they could not see the depth. It remained hidden, always, invariably, and that was precisely what made the ocean special. The sailors of those times set out on small vessels, wooden boats, handmade, corked, tarred, familiar down to every crack. Sails made of cloth or leather that caught the wind and pulled them forward. Oars for when there was no wind. And all around, water. First green, then blue, then dark blue, then so deep that color ceased to matter. They didn't know where the ocean ended. It wasn't a metaphor. It was literally true. No one knew if it had an end. Some thought it reached the edge of the earth, and there the water fell down into the void. Some thought it was circular, and if you went far enough, you'd return to where you started. No one knew for sure. They didn't know how deep it was. Maybe a few dozen steps. Maybe more than anyone could imagine. They knew only one thing. There was something enormous beneath them. Something that had no bottom, in the sense that a river or a lake has a bottom. Something that stretched down so far that the very thought of it caused a slight dizziness. And that knowledge was always with them, as long as they were sailing, like a quiet background that couldn't be turned off. Sometimes the sea was calm. The waves gently rocked the boat, rhythmically, almost like a breath. The sun was shining. The wind was blowing steadily. Everything was going just as it should. In moments like these, it seemed as though the whole world was slowing down. That you could just sit there, listen to the water, look at the horizon, and think of nothing. It was a good feeling, but sometimes everything changed. The wind died down, not gradually, but all of a sudden. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. The sail went limp. The boat stopped moving. All around, absolute silence, the kind you never find on land. Silence without the rustle of leaves, without the sound of footsteps, without anything familiar. The surface became strangely smooth, almost mirror-like. So much so that the reflection in it seemed more real than the sky itself. And in those moments, many felt something that is hard to describe precisely. Not fear, or not quite fear. More like heightened awareness, as if all their senses were becoming slightly sharper, as if their bodies were automatically shifting into a state of alertness, as if the depths beneath them were drawing closer, as if something beneath the water, something huge, slow, ancient, might know of them. No one could prove it. No one saw anything concrete. But the sensation kept recurring, in different people, in different seas, at different times. Too often to ignore, too similar to be a coincidence. And over time, it turned into stories. People began telling each other about what they felt at sea, about the strange silence that comes without warning, about places where the water seemed darker than usual, not because of clouds, not because of a depth that could be explained, just darker, as if something down there were absorbing the light, about depths that seemed to have no bottom, about how the rope went down, and down and down, and never caught on anything. Legends emerged. Huge creatures living in the depths, so large that a boat next to them looked like a splinter. Creatures that sometimes rise to the surface, not to attack, but simply to look, just to swim by, just to remind us that the depths are inhabited. Shadows that can sometimes be seen underwater, on a clear day when the light penetrates deeper than usual. Huge, slow, moving along their own path, paying no attention to the surface. Places where the compass, for those who had one, behaved strangely, where the currents flowed the wrong way, where the water had a different color, a different temperature, a different smell. These stories weren't precise. They lacked dates and coordinates. They hadn't been verified, but they had one thing in common: respect. Respect for the depths, for what cannot be seen, for what is greater than you. People understood. The ocean isn't just water between the shores. It's a space, a vast, dark, living space that cannot be seen in its entirety, that cannot be measured by familiar standards. Sometimes, during long voyages, sailors would lower heavy stones on ropes into the water. It was a way to figure out where the bottom was. If the rope tightened, it meant they had reached it. You could tell how shallow it was here, how safe. The rope went down, deeper and deeper. The stone pulled it, and it slipped through their fingers, meter by meter, elbow by elbow. Sometimes it would tighten. The bottom had been found, and there was something reassuring about that, knowing there was a limit beneath you, that the depth was finite, that the world here was measurable. But sometimes the rope would run out. The last knot would slip through your fingers. And that was it. No more rope. And still no bottom. This caused surprise. Not panic, not horror. Surprise. Quiet, almost solemn. A man stood in a small wooden boat, holding the end of the rope that had run out. And he understood that what lay beneath him was deeper than anything he could measure, deeper than he could imagine. And what to do about it? It was unclear. It was simply a fact. A huge, silent, irrefutable fact. At moments like this, people fell silent. Not because they had nothing to say, but because words seemed inadequate. Too small for this discovery. At night, the ocean looked different. As the sun set, the water darkened. Not gradually, but as if all at once. One moment it was blue, and the next it was almost black. The stars reflected on the surface, and it seemed as though there were twice as many. Some overhead, others beneath his feet. The sky mirrored itself in the water, and the boundary between them almost vanished. On nights like this, a person in a boat felt different. Not bad, not scary, different. Above, an endless sky full of stars, stretching so far into the depths that the very thought of it took one's breath away for a second. Below, an endless dark depth, in which perhaps there was also its own sky, its own stars, its own infinity. and he between them, on a thin wooden plank, right on the border of two infinities. It was both frightening and beautiful. A person who could endure that sensation, not flee from it mentally, not drown it out with conversation or work, but simply be within it. Such a person understood something important, something that could not be conveyed in words, only experienced. Sometimes a strange glow appeared in the water. As the boat moved through the darkness, small bluish lights would flicker around its sides. They flashed in the swirls of water, where the oar entered the water, where the bow of the boat cut through the surface. They flickered, flowed, and vanished. People didn't know what it was. They didn't know about the tiny living creatures that glow when disturbed. To them, it was simply light, alive, inexplicable, quiet. Some thought they were water spirits. Others thought it was a sign. Whether good or bad depended on who was watching and what they were feeling at that moment. But almost everyone who saw it fell silent, because it was beautiful, quietly beautiful, not loud, not blinding, but exactly like this, barely noticeable, fragile, as if the light might vanish if you looked too intently or thought about it too loudly. Moments like that were remembered, not as events, as sensations, as something impossible to describe, yet impossible to forget. And they became part of the stories. Not the main part, not the plot, but the backdrop. The thing that brought the story to life. Over time, these stories were passed on. From sailor to sailor, from father to son, from one shore to another. They changed along the way. Details were added. Some specifics were lost, and others were gained. They sometimes became more fantastical, sometimes more concrete. But at their core, one thing always remained: a sensation, a vivid, indestructible sensation of a depth that cannot be seen. People who had never ventured out onto the open sea listened to these stories and felt something. Not exactly what a sailor felt in the middle of the ocean at night, but something similar, an echo of something vast. And that was important, because understanding, true understanding, not information, but understanding itself, often comes not through facts. It comes through images, through stories, through sensations that are passed from one person to another, changing but never losing their essence. That is how the first understanding of the ocean took shape. Not scientific, not precise, without coordinates or measurements, but profound in its own way, precisely because it left room for the unknown, precisely because it did not claim to be complete. Some tried to stay closer to the shore, where the water is clear and you can see the bottom, where you can orient yourself by the land, where, if necessary, land was just a stone's throw away. The open sea frightened them, not with specific dangers, but with its very nature, its boundlessness, its unpredictability. It was an honest choice, a reasonable one. The shore offered certainty, and certainty offered peace. But there were also those who went further. They went where the land vanished beyond the horizon, where there were no landmarks except the stars, and the wind, where the only floor beneath their feet was a thin wooden plank, and beneath it hundreds, perhaps thousands of fathoms of dark water. Why did they go? For different reasons. Some out of necessity, some in search of a new shore, some simply because they couldn't help but go, because the horizon beckoned, because the unknown was not only frightening, but also alluring, and it was they who brought back new stories about places where the water changed color, turning greenish-gray or bright blue, so blue it seemed to glow from within, about the temperature that suddenly shifted, a cold current in the middle of a warm sea, like someone's hand reaching up from below, about sounds heard in the silence of a windless night, distant, low, seeming to come from the very depths. These observations could not be verified. They could not be deliberately replicated. But they repeated themselves again and again among different people in different places. And that is precisely why they remained in memory. Years passed. Centuries passed. People built ships that were larger and stronger. They studied the stars more accurately. They drew maps, at first rough, then increasingly detailed. The world became better known, more understandable, more measurable. But the ocean remained special. It did not resist exploration. It simply took its time revealing itself. It gave itself away slowly, bit by bit, allowing one shore to be mapped, then another, then marking the currents, then measuring the depth in one place, then another. But in its entirety, it never gave itself up completely. There was always something further, deeper, darker. And therein lay its power. Everything that a person cannot see begins to live in their imagination. This is neither a weakness nor a mistake. It is a property of the human mind to fill the void, when the void is vast, like the depth of the ocean. Then what fills it grows to enormous proportions. The ocean became a repository for everything that cannot be explained, a place where things live that should not exist, but which exist because humans cannot prove otherwise. This is how the first, deepest understanding of the sea was formed. Not as a road, not as a source of food, not as an obstacle, as a boundary between the known and the unknown, between the world that humans see and understand, and the world that exists on its own, regardless of whether anyone is looking at it or not, regardless of whether anyone knows about it or not. This boundary was everywhere. One only had to go far enough, or lower a rope deep enough, or stay out on the water long enough at night when the stars reflect in the darkness, and it's unclear where the sky ends and the depths begin. And when the waves gently rocked the boats beneath the night sky, people would sometimes just stare into the dark water, not in search of answers, not out of fear. They just looked, and they felt beneath them was not just the depth. Beneath them was a whole world, another slow, dark world living by its own laws, a world that existed before humans, that will exist after, a world that is in no hurry to be found. And perhaps there was a wisdom in that. Over time, the world around man began to change. Not the world itself. It remained the same shores, the same waves, the same dark water flowing downward to who knows where. It was man who changed. The way he looked at everything around him changed. Before, it was enough to feel, to sense the presence of something immense beneath them, and accept it as a given, as a part of the world that needed no explanation. The ocean was a mystery, and that mystery was respected. It lived in legends, in stories told by the fire, in the caution of experienced sailors who knew there are places best left unexplored. But gradually, that was no longer enough. People began to observe more closely, to compare one place with another, one day with another, one voyage with another, to notice not only what was frightening, but also what was recurring, what could be described, what perhaps could be understood. And the mystery began to turn into a question. How deep is the ocean? What lies at the bottom? Is it the same everywhere? And, most importantly, can we find out? It was a quiet revolution, imperceptible from the outside, but significant. Because to ask a question is to admit the possibility of an answer. It means to stop accepting the unknown as a final fact and to start treating it as a problem. The first attempts were simple, almost naively simple, if viewed from a distance. But there was something right about that simplicity, something honest. Sailors would take a heavy stone, tie it to a long rope, and lower it into the water. That was all. No complicated tools, no mechanisms. A stone, a rope, patience. They waited until the stone reached the bottom and the rope tightened. Then they marked the length, with a notch, a knot, or simply by memorizing it. That was the depth. The process was slow. The rope went down, meter by meter. The water absorbed it silently. It didn't swallow it, didn't pull it, just accepted it. People stood over the side and watched as it disappeared into the dark water. They waited for the tension. Sometimes it came quickly. Sometimes they had to wait a long time, a very long time, standing there, holding the rope in their hands, feeling it continue to slip, and realizing that the bottom was still far away. And sometimes the rope ran out before the bottom. The last meter slipped through their fingers. And that was it. The end. And down below, it was still empty, still dark, still unknown. Moments like these were not forgotten. These measurements were inaccurate. Even those who took them understood this. The waves rocked the boat, and the rope didn't go straight down, but at an angle, which made the result longer than the actual distance. The current carried the weight off to the side. The rope could get tangled, form a loop, or catch on some ledge. Even the weight itself, heavy but not infinitely heavy, could slow down in the water so much that it was hard to tell whether it had touched the bottom or was simply suspended. The margin of error was large, sometimes very large. And yet this was the beginning. Not because the results were accurate, but because the principle itself had emerged. Movement had emerged. Not just looking at the water, and imagining what lay beneath it, but doing something concrete to find out. Lowering the rope, waiting, marking, comparing. This small shift from feeling to measurement changed a great deal. Over time, there were more measurements, and from them, something unexpected began to emerge. The depth was changing. It would seem this should have been obvious, but no. Before, people thought of the ocean as something more or less uniform. The bottom? It's just the bottom. Somewhere down there, far away. Pretty much the same everywhere. But the measurements told a different story. Here the rope stretched 20 meters. There, 50. In a third spot, it went down 100 meters and found nothing. The seafloor wasn't flat. It had a shape, complex, unpredictable. Nothing like what the imagination had pictured. The ocean had its own relief, its own irregularities, its own depressions and elevations, its own places where the depth dropped sharply, as if the ground beneath the water were suddenly slipping away from under our feet. This discovery was quiet, without grand announcements, without loud words, just a gradual accumulation of data from which a picture emerged. A picture that said, what lies beneath the water is no simpler than what lies above it. Perhaps even more complex. In the 18th and 19th centuries, interest in the ocean took on a different character. Previously, the sea was studied incidentally, during trade or military voyages on the side, when there was time and inclination. Now expeditions emerged whose sole purpose was knowledge. People set sail not for goods or new lands. They set sail for understanding. Logs appeared on ships, not ship's logs, but scientific ones. Everything was recorded in them. The date, coordinates, depth, water temperature, color, transparency, and the nature of the seabed, if they managed to reach it. Each observation was a separate entry. Each entry was a small brick in the edifice of knowledge, which was built slowly and required immense patience. Instruments were being refined. Instead of ordinary ropes, they began using special lines with precise markings at regular intervals. The weights became heavier and more efficient. Their shape was calculated so that they would descend vertically without being carried off course by the current. Devices appeared that collected soil samples, small samples of what the ocean floor is made of. It was no longer just a question of how deep. It was a question of what's down there. And that's when the real surprises began. In some places, the depth increased sharply, not gradually, not smoothly, but as if it were dropping off. Where they expected to find the sea floor at the usual depth, it wasn't there. The line went down further than anticipated, much further. People double-checked. They took repeated measurements. They returned to the same spot a few days later, a few months later. The result remained the same. Beneath the ocean were abysses. Not in a figurative sense, literally. Places where the seafloor plunged to depths that were hard to even imagine. Several kilometers of water overhead, not a few hundred meters, but kilometers. The pressure there was such that it would crush any vessel known at the time. The darkness was absolute, without a single ray of light. The cold was near freezing, and all of this existed. Right now, beneath the surface over which ships sailed. Scientists of that time tried to explain how such a thing was possible. They spoke of the movement of the Earth's crust, of processes that have been occurring for millions of years, so slowly that humans cannot perceive them, but whose results are immense. In many ways they were right, though a complete understanding had not yet been reached. The puzzle was coming together, but slowly, and many pieces were still missing. In the mid-19th century, something important happened. Though at first, it seemed like a purely practical task. A telegraph cable needed to be laid across the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean to connect Europe and America, to give them the ability to communicate almost instantly, rather than waiting weeks for a ship to cross the ocean with a message. This required knowing exactly what the seabed looked like, where it was flat, where there were obstacles, where there were sharp drops in depth that could damage the cable. And so, the measurements became systematic, methodical, thorough, section by section, point by point, across the entire ocean. It was a massive undertaking, tedious, demanding attention and patience. But it was precisely this work that yielded what had never existed before, a detailed map of the seabed. And the map turned out to be nothing like what had been expected. Vast plains, flat as the steppe, stretching for thousands of kilometers. Underwater mountains, entire ranges whose existence no one had suspected. Deep trenches resembling narrow gashes in the ocean floor. All of this existed there, hidden, invisible, unnamed. There was another world underwater, with its own terrain, its own mountains and valleys, its own geography, no less complex than that on land, only invisible. By the end of the 19th century, something had changed in the very attitude toward the unknown. Before, the unknown was simply the unknown, something that exists, but about which little can be said. Now it had become measurable, in the sense that people began to understand its scale. They began to see exactly how much of the unknown remained, and in which directions to move forward. It is a special feeling to know enough to understand how much you still don't know. It isn't depressing. It provides guidance. It gives direction. It says, there is darkness here. That is where we should go. Some measurements yielded strange results, numbers that didn't fit into the overall picture, depths that turned out to be much greater at one point than at neighboring ones, temperatures that behaved differently than they should have, soil samples in which something unexpected was discovered. Most often, an explanation was found, a measurement error, a peculiarity in the current, an anomaly that, upon closer inspection, turned out to be quite explainable. But not always. Sometimes an observation was simply recorded and remained in the logs without an explanation, as an honest admission that there was no answer yet, that something had happened, something had been noticed, but exactly what? It was unclear. These records were important, not because they contained the answer, but because they contained honesty. Honesty in the face of the unknown. By the beginning of the 20th century, knowledge of the ocean had grown significantly. Maps became more detailed, measurements more precise, understanding deeper. It was already possible to speak of the seafloor's topography with some confidence, to cite approximate figures, to describe general patterns. But along with this, something else became clear. The more people learned about the ocean, the clearer it became just how much still remained unknown. This was not a cause for disappointment. It was a reason to continue. Because depth could be measured, now with reasonable accuracy. The contours of underwater mountains and basins could be mapped. The numbers could be known. But numbers are not the same as understanding. Knowing that at a certain point the ocean is 8 kilometers deep is one thing. It is quite another to imagine what that is like. What happens down there? What the seafloor looks like, where no light has ever fallen. What lives in that darkness, under the monstrous pressure of the water? People still didn't know that. They knew the distance to the bottom, but not the bottom itself. And in that gap, between number and reality, between measurement and vision, a mystery remained. A quiet, calm, patient mystery. The very one that was there in the beginning. Only now it knew its place on the map. The ocean revealed itself slowly. Not because it resisted. It simply wasn't in a hurry. It existed long before anyone began to measure it. It would continue to exist afterward. Meanwhile, ships continued their journey across the surface. Lines stretched into the depths again and again. Records accumulated in the logs. The maps became a little more detailed year after year, and it became increasingly clear. This was only the beginning. The true world of the ocean was still waiting there, down below, in the silence, in the darkness, in the depths that had yet to be not just measured, but seen, understood, named. But first, they had to learn how to descend. By the beginning of the 20th century, people already knew a great deal about the ocean. They could measure its depth with reasonable, though not perfect, accuracy. They could hypothesize about the shape of the seafloor and map the general contours of the underwater terrain. They could speak of underwater trenches and mountain ranges as if they had seen them with their own eyes. But that was precisely what they hadn't done. Everything that was known came through a rope and a weight, through a number on paper, through a line on a map. It was knowledge from a distance, accurate within its limits, but constrained by the very nature of the method. You can measure the depth of a well without looking inside it. But there is only one way to see what lies at the bottom. And then a new idea emerged. Not just to measure the ocean, but to descend into it, to see with their own eyes what until then had existed only in numbers and assumptions. The idea seemed almost insane, but it was logical. The obstacles were real and serious. The depths are dark. This is obvious, but it's worth dwelling on. The darkness there is not like that of night on the surface. At night, there is always at least something. Stars, reflections, scattered light. In the depths of the ocean, below a certain depth, there is absolutely nothing. Not a single photon. Absolute, physically dense darkness, in which the eyes do not simply fail to see. They become useless. The pressure is immense. With every 10 meters of depth, the water pressure increases by approximately 1 atmosphere. At a depth of 100 meters, 10 atmospheres. At 1 kilometer, 100. At several kilometers, hundreds of atmospheres, crushing everything not specifically designed for it. The human body, an ordinary metal vessel, any structure without special preparation, all of this would be crushed long before reaching the bottom. An ordinary person could not get down there. This was a physical fact, not a metaphor. But technology began to change. Slowly, cautiously, step by step. The first submersibles were simple, almost crude by later standards. Metal spheres with thick walls designed to withstand the pressure. Small portholes made of incredibly strong glass. Inside, barely enough room for 1 or 2 people. No engine. The apparatus was lowered on a cable from the ship, like a weight on a rope, only in the opposite direction. The first dives were cautious, slow. The people inside didn't know exactly what awaited them. They knew the theory. But theory is one thing, and the moment when the hatch closes and the surface begins to recede upward is quite another. At first, everything looked familiar. Light penetrated the water, greenish, alive, shifting. Fish, jellyfish, the familiar life of the upper layers were visible. Nothing unexpected, nothing frightening. But the deeper the submersible descended, the more everything around it changed. The light grew dimmer, not abruptly, gradually, like the fading of evening. First, the red color faded from the water. It was absorbed by the water within the first few dozen meters. Then the orange, then the yellow. The world beyond the porthole turned first blue-green, then simply blue, then dark blue, almost violet. And then the blue disappeared too, and darkness fell. That moment was remembered by everyone who experienced it, the moment when the last glimmer of surface light dissolved somewhere above, and only darkness remained. Outside, beyond the porthole glass, not the gradual, soft darkness of twilight. Absolute. There was no day or night. There were no shadows. Shadows arise where there is light that can be obstructed. There was no horizon, no top or bottom in the usual sense. Only the craft itself, with its dim interior lighting and darkness all around, on every side, thick as a wall. At first, it seemed as though there was nothing there. Emptiness, silence, the absolute absence of anything. But then, movement. At first, barely perceptible. Something slipped past the porthole. a vague silhouette that the darkness swallowed before the eyes could grasp what exactly they had seen. Then another. And then light. Not reflected, not brought from above. Its own. A small, soft, living flame in absolute darkness. Then another. Then several at once. Creatures that created light themselves. It was one of the most powerful discoveries, not in terms of scientific significance, but in terms of its impact on the person who witnessed it. Life where it was not expected, life that did not need the sun, that had found its own way to exist in conditions that seemed incompatible with life. The creatures were unusual, so much so that the first observers struggled to find words to describe them. Some were almost transparent, like living glass through which internal organs could be seen. Some had long tentacles that moved so slowly they seemed frozen. Some bore tiny lights on their bodies. They flared and faded in their own rhythm, incomprehensible and mesmerizing. They moved without haste, without fuss, without sudden movements, as if different laws truly applied in this place, not only physical ones, but temporal ones as well, as if time flowed differently here. Slower, or entirely differently than on the surface. The people inside the vehicles watched in silence. They took notes. They sketched. They tried to analyze. But often they simply looked, because it was unlike anything they had seen before. Because the words and categories they had brought down with them did not quite fit what was unfolding behind the glass. In the 1930s, the first dives that went down in history took place. People descended to depths that had previously only been discussed in numbers. Now they were there, physically, bodily, just a few centimeters of metal away from water that would gladly have crushed the apparatus if the walls had been even slightly thinner. They saw the light fade. This matched the theory. They felt the vessel creaking under the pressure. That was less pleasant. They looked into the darkness and saw life there. This refuted what many had believed, because for a long time it was thought, there is nothing at great depths. Too dark, too cold, too much pressure. Life requires the sun. That seemed obvious, almost an axiom. But life didn't read textbooks. It was there. Quiet, slow, strange, but alive. That changed a lot. Not just in science, in the very idea of where life is possible and under what conditions. Later, the vehicles got better, stronger, more reliable, capable of descending deeper. And people went deeper, to places where the pressure was no longer just high, but almost unimaginable. To places where the ocean floor lies a few kilometers from the surface, closer to the center of the earth than to the sky. The descent took hours. Hour after hour, the submersible slowly descended, without an engine, simply under its own weight, ballasted and steered. Outside, absolute darkness, broken only by the light of searchlights that illuminated a narrow cone of space in front of the porthole. Rare creatures swam through this cone and vanished. Most of the time, only darkness inside, silence, and anticipation. And when the submersible finally touched the bottom, gently, carefully, stirring up a cloud of sediment, it was a special moment. People looked down into the deepest part of the ocean and saw there is life there too. Small creatures moved across the seafloor, slowly, calmly, as if the pressure, darkness, and cold were not extreme conditions for them, but simply home, a familiar environment, the only one they knew. This discovery raised questions, the answers to which came slowly. How do they live without light? It turned out, not through photosynthesis, like most life on the surface, but through chemosynthesis, using the chemical energy provided by the Earth itself, where hot streams burst from the ocean floor, hydrothermal vents. Life thrives around them, a separate ecosystem, completely independent of the sun. How do they withstand the pressure? Their bodies are built differently. There are no air cavities that pressure would crush. Everything is filled with fluid that does not yield to pressure. These answers were important. But just as important was something else. The realization that life can find ways where, it would seem, there are none. Sometimes the instruments recorded movements that remained unexplained. Sounds, dull, low, sometimes repetitive, that could not be definitively attributed to any known source. Silhouettes that the spotlight caught for a split second, and which vanished before anything could be made out. Scientists explained this by water movement, tectonic processes, known organisms, or simply poor visibility. Most often, the explanation was correct, but not always. Some observations remained in the archives without explanation. Just a record, just a fact, without a conclusion. With every dive, people understood more. And with every dive, they felt it more keenly. The ocean cannot be studied quickly. It does not reveal itself all at once. It reveals itself layer by layer, depth by depth, question by question. And even when you reach the bottom, it is not the end. Because the bottom is vast, because the explored point is just a point, not the entire ocean. Most of it remains unseen by the human eye. But the most important thing these dives brought was not records or maps. It was a feeling, a quiet, almost inexpressible understanding that there, down below, in the darkness, under monstrous pressure, exists a whole world, its own, unlike ours, living by its own rules, in its own time, needing neither our presence nor expecting it. A world that existed long before the first dive, and will continue to exist after the last. As the submersibles slowly rose back up, toward the light, toward the surface, toward the familiar world, the people carried with them more than just data. They carried that feeling, that they had been there, that they had touched something very vast and very real, and that what lay ahead was even deeper, even quieter, even more mysterious. Over time, humans learned to dive deeper. The equipment became sturdier, the instruments more precise, the cameras more sensitive. The ocean was no longer completely hidden, but it still remained, not fully understood. The more people explored the depths, the more often they encountered things they couldn't explain right away. These weren't sensational discoveries. Rather, they were quiet observations, the kind you first record and then spend a long time trying to understand. In some areas of the seafloor, strange shapes began to appear. When a beam of light swept across the surface, lines became visible, sometimes almost straight, sometimes intersecting. They didn't look like ordinary natural irregularities. Too precise, too orderly. Scientists speculated that these might be features of geological processes, cracks in the rock, traces of the Earth's crust moving, the result of pressure and time. And often this did indeed explain what they saw. But sometimes there remained a feeling that it wasn't that simple. Some structures looked unusual even to experienced researchers. They didn't jump to conclusions. They simply recorded the data and continued to observe. In other places, the instruments registered sounds. Deep, low, sometimes drawn out, sometimes short and repetitive. The ocean itself is full of sounds. The movement of water, tectonic processes, living creatures, all of this creates a complex soundscape. But among these sounds, some would occasionally emerge that drew special attention. They were rhythmic, too steady to seem random, too unusual to immediately identify the source. Scientists recorded them, analyzed them, compared them to known sounds. And in most cases, they found an explanation, but not always. Some signals remained without a precise answer. They didn't repeat often. They appeared and disappeared, as if the depths allowed them to be heard for just a moment, and then fell silent again. Sometimes during dives, cameras captured movements in the distance, at the edge of the light, where the spotlight no longer fully illuminated the space. They could have been large animals, or shadows distorted by the water, or simply the play of light and distance. The scientists took it in stride. They understood that in the depths, many things can look different than they really are. But such moments were still memorable, because the depths always leave room for the unknown. With the development of technology, people began using autonomous vehicles. they could descend without a human, explore large areas, and record data over long periods of time. It was precisely these vehicles that sometimes captured unusual things, not always understandable. Sometimes temperature changes in unexpected places. Sometimes water movements that didn't match known currents. Sometimes structures that could not be classified immediately. Most of these phenomena eventually received an explanation. Science moved forward, step by step, but there remained observations that did not fit into the usual framework. They did not contradict science. They simply waited, waiting until enough knowledge emerged to understand them. And there was something serene about that. The depths were in no hurry to reveal everything at once. It was as if they were keeping a part of themselves hidden, not because of any mystery, but simply because that is how the world works. Sometimes, during prolonged observations, researchers noticed another peculiarity. The ocean at depth seemed too quiet, not just silent, but as if it were absorbing sound. Even instruments recorded this. Sounds quickly faded away. The space seemed to dampen them. This was explained by the physical properties of water, pressure, and the characteristics of the environment. But the sensation remained, as if the depths themselves create a special space, separate, slow, calm. Sometimes researchers said that under such conditions, the perception of time changes. Movements seem smoother, events more drawn out, sounds more rare. This wasn't a scientific fact. Rather, it was a personal sensation. But it was repeated by different people. And it, too, became part of the collective experience. Over time, a wealth of data accumulated. Records, observations, measurements. Most of it was explained, incorporated into the scientific picture of the world. But a small part remained, open without a definitive answer. And that was normal, because science doesn't require knowing everything at once. It moves gradually, accepting the unknown as part of the journey. The ocean continued to hold on to its peculiarities, not as mysteries that must be solved, but as a natural part of its depth. And the more people learned, the clearer one thing became. depth is not just a place. It is a process of constant discovery, of constant observation, of constant movement forward. And even now, when technology allows us to see more and more, there remains a space below that has not yet been explored. Quiet, dark, serene. And in this silence, there are still things waiting for their time, without rushing, without disappearing, just staying there, where the depths become almost endless. Today, humanity knows far more about the ocean than ever before. Detailed maps of the seafloor have been created. Thousands of new life forms have been discovered, and the currents, pressure, temperature, and processes that shape this vast aquatic world have been studied. Satellites monitor the surface. Underwater vehicles explore the depths, and data is collected and analyzed around the world. It would seem that the ocean is gradually ceasing to be a mystery. But along with this has come another, quieter realization. Despite all these achievements, most of the ocean remains unexplored. There are areas where vehicles have descended only once or twice. There are sections of the seafloor that have been recorded by instruments, but never observed directly. And there are depths where humans cannot yet stay long enough to truly understand what is happening. This is not a cause for alarm. Rather, it evokes a quiet sense of awe, because the ocean does not hide itself on purpose. It is simply too vast, too deep, and too complex to be fully explored in a short time. Its scale transcends our usual perception, and that is precisely why it remains so special, especially in the modern world. If you imagine the deepest parts of the ocean, you can picture a space where perpetual darkness reigns. There is no sunlight, no familiar division between day and night, no rapid changes. The temperature remains almost constant. The water moves slowly, and everything around seems motionless. And yet there is life there. Quiet, slow, sustained. The creatures that live at these depths have adapted to conditions that once seemed impossible. They do not rush, do not waste energy, and move smoothly and almost imperceptibly. Their world does not require sudden actions, only constancy. Scientists continue to study them, collecting data, analyzing behavior, observing the smallest details. With each new dive, the picture becomes clearer, but it never becomes fully complete. Because with every answer, a new question arises. Sometimes instruments record phenomena that take time to explain. These may be unusual temperature fluctuations, strange water movements, rare signals, or features of the seabed that aren't immediately understandable. In most cases, answers are found, but not always right away. Some observations remain in the records for years. They don't contradict science. They're simply waiting for new knowledge. They wait for new technologies. They wait for the moment when they can be seen in a different light. And there is a special harmony in this, because science is not just about answers, but also about the process of discovery. And the ocean remains one of those places where this process continues with particular calm and without interruption. When modern instruments descend into the depths, they carry light with them. This light illuminates only a small space around it. Everything else remains in darkness, beyond the limits of visibility. And this reminds us of scale, of just how vast this depth is, of the fact that even now, humans see only a part of it, a small part, a limited part, but an important one. Sometimes during long observations, researchers notice that the depths alter the perception of time. Movements seem smoother, events more infrequent, and the silence deeper. This cannot be measured by instruments, but it can be felt, as if the ocean itself slows down everything that enters it. And in this slowing down, there is peace. No sudden changes, no noise, no rush, only a constant, steady existence. And perhaps that is why many people who study the ocean speak of it not only as a scientific subject, but also as a place that teaches calm. The ocean does not provide quick answers. It does not conform to expectations. It simply exists. And if you observe it long enough, it becomes clear that there is a logic to this, a depth of its own, a silence of its own. Many areas of the ocean remain only partially explored to this day. Some depths have been reached only a few times in all of history, and perhaps it is precisely there that the discoveries yet to be made lie. But these discoveries do not disappear. They simply remain where they have always been, in silence, in darkness, in the depths. And this does not create tension. On the contrary, it creates a sense that the world is still open, that there remains space within it for the future, for new steps, for new observations, for new understandings. When a person looks at the ocean today, from the shore, from a ship, or through the screens of instruments, they can see more than just the surface. They can imagine that beneath it lies a whole world, a world that is in no hurry, a world that does not demand attention, a world that simply is. And there is a special calm in this. The realization that not everything needs to be known right away, that some things can remain unknown, and yet not disrupt the harmony. The ocean continues to exist just as it always has. Waves gently move across the surface. The wind blows over the water. Light reflects, shifts, and fades. Day gives way to night, and this rhythm remains unchanged. And below, the depth, quiet, almost motionless, constant. It connects the past and the present, from the ancient tales of sailors to modern research. It remains the same part of the world. Only the ways of understanding it change. But the depth itself remains. And perhaps it will remain so for a very long time. And there is something soothing about that. Because in a world where so much changes quickly, the ocean remains an example of slow, steady existence. It reminds us that not everything has to happen at once, that some processes take time, that understanding comes gradually. And when a person allows themselves to stop, to slow down, to take a deep breath, they can feel this rhythm, the rhythm of the waves, the rhythm of the depths, the rhythm of a peaceful existence. Thoughts grow quieter. Breathing becomes more even, and gradually everything superfluous fades away. Only the sensation of space remains, wide, deep, calm, and in this state, there is no need to seek or explain anything. It is enough simply to be here, now, in this quiet moment, where there is the surface, bright and familiar, and there is the depth, distant, calm, unchanging, and together they create balance, gentle, constant, reliable. And in this balance, it is easy to let go of thoughts, to let the day end, to let the body relax, and just close my eyes, knowing that somewhere far away beneath the water, the depth remains, quiet, dark, and calm, and it's in no hurry to go anywhere. And perhaps that is exactly why it's so easy right now to simply fall asleep.